Okay, welcome to Feedback, Erudit 2012 to 2013, feedback on the homework assignment for 601 Linguistique Lexique. Okay, this is a compulsory course except for those of you who are doing the research paper with me, which means there are quite a lot of people, but surprisingly not a lot of people actually sent in the homework, which is a bit of a shame. Okay, the marks don't count towards your degree. It can only be an advantage to you, and various other reasons which I've given the course for why it's important to do homework. But if you didn't, well, you didn't. Okay, so we'll go through this. It's not going to be a corrigé as such with model answers. It's going to be a discussion as if we were in class together. Thank you to those of you who use the model answer sheet on the Erudit homepage. And thank you for using alternate lines or large margins. Well, not everybody did, which means that my comments, it's more difficult for me to input comments in. Seeing as my writing is not very good anyway, that's unfortunate. Okay, out of 20, the overall mark average was 11.5, which is good. That's partly because you're self-selecting. Presumably only people who felt comfortable with the course would send in the homework. The lowest mark was 7.5 out of 20. The highest mark was 17. A couple of people got 9.5, but overall 2/3 of students passed. So good. Of course, there is a difference between doing homework and doing an exam, and this was the exam from last September when students, from last June, when students don't have access to the course, the internet, etc. So imagine to yourself what would it have been like if you'd done this in a classroom in an exam situation. Okay, so we'll go through it. Section 1 is relatively factual. As I say, not a model, but potential areas you could work on, if you like. So question 1, the average was 7.7 out of 10. High marks, which was what we expect. That's one of the reasons for having this type of question at the beginning, is to give you a little bit of confidence at the beginning of the exam and to give you some relatively easy marks as well, especially, of course, when you have the resources available. A, what is the difference between lexicology and lexicography? An easy 2 points. Yes, it is a difference. Lexicology is the linguistic study of lexis, words, vocabulary. Lexicography is making dictionaries, everything involved in making dictionaries. So the two can inform each other, but they are different practices. A lexicographer is not the same as a lexicologist. B, what kinds of antonymy are there in English? Okay, see the course, page 22 forward. Again, in the exam, would you know these different types? What helps here is to give them names. There are 3 basic ones which I mentioned. Give them names, give examples, and describe them. And really you need to do all those 3 things, the names, the description, and the examples, to get the full points here. C, in the Oxford English Dictionary, the word round can have lots of different parts of speech. Why are there so many different parts of speech, and how does this compare to French? So 2 parts to the question to get the full marks. One thing to note is that English, of course, is a Germanic language, as we know, which makes it different from French, which is a Romance language based on Latin. English is not based on Latin. Even if it has lots of Latin vocabulary, English is not a Romance language. English is a Germanic language, but it lost a lot of the inflections over time. So where French still has lots of inflections for verbs in particular, most notably, think of all the verb endings you can have in French. They've disappeared in English. Well, they disappeared in English before spelling change, whereas in France they disappeared in pronunciation after the spelling had been fixed. So we still write them even if we don't say them. And because we don't have those endings in English, that makes it much easier for one word to be different parts of speech. A noun can become a verb. You don't need to have a verbal ending to show that it's a verb, like you do in French in most cases. But still in French you have coucher and coucher de soleil. Je me couche, une couche. So there are possibilities for conversion in French, but not as much as in English. It's a little bit more complicated. D, which of French or English makes greater use of compounding and why? So which and why? Again, because English is a Germanic language where compounding is common in all Germanic languages as far as I know. If you know German or another Germanic language, think of something like Straßenbahn, Haltestelle. It's all one word. Yeah, it's easy to do in Germanic languages. Not so easy in French, at least not so easy to get them all together. But if you have something like prêt-à-porter, it's one meaning, one unit of meaning. So basically what you have is a compound noun. but it's the fact that it has a preposition in it doesn't mean it's not a compound. So it's compounded in different ways. Nevertheless, there does tend to be more compounding in English, and it's closer compounding as well. Do show that you know what compounding is before you attempt to answer the question. A lot of the time, talking about compounds, we tend to focus on nouns, but this is not necessarily the case. You can also have verbs, un rendezvous or rendezvous, and even adjectives, something like unputdownable. So see the course, page 12 to 13 and elsewhere. E, give 3 words in common use in English today that come from Old Norse. Why have they lasted? A lot of you gave the same ones, ill, skin and skill. It'd be nice to have a little bit more variety. If you could actually find something new on your own rather than just going to the same sources, that would be nice. But never mind, you got 3, so that's fine. Why have they lasted? Well, Old Norse, we remember the history of English. The Old English arrived in Britain in the 5th century. Then there were Norse, Viking, Scandinavian, call them Danish, call them what you want, invasions a bit later. But the 2 languages came from similar parts of Europe, Northern Europe, and they were very close to each other. They weren't the same language because anyway, over 100 years or 2, let alone 3 or 4 or 5, languages do change, of course. And so they weren't the same language, but they had a lot of things in common. And so often, individual words would be similar in the 2 languages. If you look at Spanish today, often from knowing French, you can understand those languages, those individual words. So they're not the same, but they might be recognizable. So when you've got 2 populations, the English speakers who were established in England and the Danish invaders who were arriving, the words they had in common would often be used quite frequently. So when the Danish invaders integrated, settled down, intermarried, coexisted, in different regions, in different dialects, then you might have 2 slightly different words coexisting. Maybe one would dominate and the other one would disappear. But which one, if they were both quite similar, was a toss-up in many cases. You would think that the established word would remain, but if the invading word is quite close, then it could easily be that word as well. So that's one reason. It's the proximity between the 2 languages, which made it easier for the Danish words, the Old Norse words, to be integrated. And if you had the 2 words, which were used side by side, very often there would be a semantic drift. So one of them would keep the original meaning, the other one would start to mean something different, or maybe they would both drift a bit. Okay. Where it's more unusual, perhaps, is where the invading words completely replaced an existing word. So the example I think we had in the course somewhere was Old English had niman, and Modern English has take. Take comes from Old Norse, and it's quite unusual for a word like that to oust such a basic word. It is generally the basic words which last, so that's an exception if you like, and most of the common words in English are Germanic in origin, especially Old English, but possibly Old Norse. Once a basic word is there, think of man, woman, cloud, sky, things like that, everyday words. Once a basic word is in a language, it's very difficult to oust it, to get rid of it. But if you do manage to penetrate the language with a basic word, then it's probably going to be there for quite a long time. So the words which Old Norse managed to implant at that time are still in many cases there today. Okay, that's it for question 1. I think that's all I have to say. Some of the questions extremely quick, other ones requiring a little bit more attention. Question 2, a letter to the Guardian Weekly. Comment on what this tells us about etymology in popular perception and from a linguistic point of view. The average mark on this question was 4.6, ranging from 2 to 9. So some people did it very well, but quite a lot of people got less than half marks, partly because a lot of you seem to think that Ted Weber was representing the linguistic point of view. He's not. He's the popular perception. Okay, so the first important thing is to get it the right way around. What is the popular view and what is the linguist view? Ted Weber is not a linguist. He's somebody who writes a letter to a newspaper complaining about things. Anybody can do that, like anybody can contribute to Wikipedia. Ted Weber is obviously promoting a very snobbish view of language, and he says, but why should the word anniversary be obvious even to the most ignorant of journalists? Why should it be obvious? It's obvious to him because he did Latin or something, and he knows Latin is no longer taught. Why should it be obvious that anniversary in English comes from Latin annus? There are some words which are not particularly far away, like annual, but you might not necessarily see the connection, and even if you do, you might choose to ignore it. So my question really is, how dare this non-entity, this Ted Weber, whoever he is, accuse other people of ignorance when he doesn't know what the etymological fallacy is? What is the etymological fallacy? You can Google it. Basically, the etymological fallacy is thinking that a previous meaning of a word should be the only meaning or the best meaning today. That's simply not true. A lot of words today have meanings which are different from when the word was first used in the language. A lot of words in English don't have the same meaning they had 100, 500, 1,000 years ago. That doesn't mean that the word today is used wrongly in every case. Clearly it's not. The word meat doesn't mean the same thing it meant 1,000 years ago. That doesn't mean that every English speaker is ignorant and stupid and using the word wrong. No, they're using the word meat appropriately for the context today. For example, nice. If you look up nice, you know what nice means today, but if you look it up in the OED, the earliest attested meanings are foolish or simple. It doesn't mean that every time that you say that somebody is nice, that you're actually calling them foolish or simple. Of course it doesn't. It's totally ignorant and stupid to have this point of view that Ted Weber is promoting. He is wrong. End of story. Furthermore, he's not just talking about a previous meaning in English, he's talking about a previous meaning in a different language. I mean, how stupid can you be? But he is very, very stupid. He hasn't thought about what he's doing, what he's saying. An example in French, if you're not getting it with examples in English. Aujourd'hui. What does aujourd'hui mean? Where does aujourd'hui come from? Well, you can see au and jour and d apostrophe and oui. So you can see what jour means. What does oui mean? Oui comes from Latin hodie, which I have to say in an English accent. Hodie, which meant in Latin today. So aujourd'hui means to the day of today. Well, that's stupid. And when you say au jour d'aujourd'hui, you've got triple. You're saying today of today of today, which is just silly. But aujourd'hui is a normal expression in French today. You wouldn't, if you tried to not say aujourd'hui and just say oui, you'd just be daft, basically. Or se suicider. Suicider comes from Latin, literally to kill yourself. So se suicider means to kill yourself, which is daft. But that's what language is. It would be wrong to say suicider without se suicider, without the se in front of it. Okay, so Ted Weber is wrong. End of story. There is no debate. He's not a linguist. He's an ignorant person who knows nothing about linguistics. Right there. I always have a little rant. I like to have a bit of a rant. But make sure, of course, that you don't rant in your exam papers. So coming back to anniversary. Anniversary, if you look in many dictionaries, the first meaning it will give is an annual event which occurs on the day which marks exactly 1 year or 2 or 5 or 10 years of some event in the past. But that's part of the meaning, and it's an older meaning, and it's where the word comes from. But really the primary meaning today is a date which marks a round period. So there's no reason necessarily to say that we can't have a 6-month anniversary. And in fact, if you look in the Merriam-Webster, it says, and this is the full definition, you can find a Merriam-Webster online, the annual recurrence of a date marking a notable event. Broadly, a date that follows such an event by a specified period of time measured in units other than years. And the example they give is the 6-month anniversary of the accident. So Merriam-Webster, which is possibly the most prestigious American dictionary today, actually gives this space and gives this meaning. And of course, you can play with language as well. So saying a 6-month anniversary might be a deliberate choice to be playful. You might have a young couple in love who talk about their 5-month, 3-week, 4-day and 2-hour anniversary. Why not? You can play with language. So simply saying that people are ignorant because they don't use language in a canonical way eliminates any possible creativity as well. Okay, if I have been ranting, that doesn't mean that etymology is irrelevant or not interesting, and it certainly doesn't mean that words can mean whatever you want them to mean. Okay, words mean what they do mean, what the community of speakers today think they mean. That's what words really mean. Dictionaries describe words, they don't prescribe them. But that's the topic of question 3A. Right, okay. Before we get, but question 3A is interesting because it's talking about the American Heritage Dictionary and it presents it as a very prescriptive, conservative organ. But the American Heritage Dictionary, which is also a prestigious American dictionary, also gives the second possible meaning of anniversary as a date that follows a certain event by a specified amount of time. The example, his 6-month anniversary of quitting smoking. Okay, so the American Heritage Dictionary and Merriam-Webster agree that that's a possible meaning of anniversary. Okay, so question 3, 20 points, so more points for question 3 than for question 1 or 2. In fact, the same number of questions of points as for questions 1 and 2 together. I do ask you, please, on your exam papers, say if it's A or B. Occasionally, people don't indicate it, and I start reading, assuming that it's one, and it's not till I get to the end I realise it's the other one, and I have to go back and do it again. Of course, if your answer is that ambiguous, it's not going to be a very good answer anyway, but never mind. Okay, the average mark on question 3 was 10.8, the lowest was 6, the highest was 18, a very good answer. So we have here an extract from Wikipedia on the American Heritage Dictionary, the AHD. Comment, in the light of what you know, so not just a subjective appreciation, but in the light of what you know, about dictionaries, past and present, so not just dictionaries today, but going back into the history of lexicography, in French and English. So there might be a difference between the two languages there, the typical lexicographical practices in the two countries. There are differences. There are general differences and there are lots of exceptions. A general tendency is that dictionaries, many of the early dictionaries, attempted prescription of the language. In other words, they tried to put down the editor's ideas on what was correct. Okay, and that applies to most dictionaries in most countries around the world. As a rough generalization. It's still a difference to an extent today. In some dictionaries in France, such as the Académie Française, are attempting to promote a particular kind of French or particular uses and meanings of some words. That's not the usual practice today. Most dictionaries today are descriptive. In other words, they describe how words really are used. They don't try to encourage people to use words in a particular way. If a usage or a meaning is controversial, they will tell you, but they won't say this is what you should do. They will simply say, if you use it in this way, some people will criticize you. Not us, it's your choice, but that's part of what you need to know about the word. So you might have a dictionary could easily say the word anniversary is abusively, or by some people might be criticized if you use it in the sense other than a year. That's possibly worth knowing about the word anniversary. But dictionaries, descriptive dictionaries, aren't judgmental. There's nothing wrong with producing a dictionary which tries to encourage people to use words in a particular way, but it's in many cases rather a futile enterprise. This is something which Samuel Johnson noticed even in the 18th century. When he wrote his plan for the dictionary, it was very clear that he wanted in a way to fix the English language. By the time he actually produced the dictionary, the first edition of the dictionary, in 1755, the introduction or preface to the dictionary recognised that there was a futile practice, that it was not possible to fix words in particular ways. Okay, the fact that most dictionaries aim to be descriptive is not the same as how people perceive dictionaries. A lot of people think that it's in the dictionary, therefore it's correct. It's not in the dictionary, therefore it's not correct. But that's how people use dictionaries. That's not what the dictionaries are designed to do. So that's you're imposing a different judgment on the dictionary to what the dictionary actually attempts to do in most cases, except for the Académie Française, and possibly to an extent the American Heritage Dictionary, at least as presented through this extract. Today, dictionaries are certainly, as I say, overwhelmingly based on description, especially via the analysis of language corpora. Now, those of you who did translation in the first semester with me will know what a corpus is. So it's actually looking through in very, very large collections of text at how words are actually used and what they really mean in those contexts. So it's not a question of going back to the etymology of a word to see what it used to mean. It's not a question of just thinking what you want it to mean or trying to impose your opinion. It's actually looking at the real uses and meanings of words. Some dictionaries are historical, like the Oxford English Dictionary, but it's still descriptive. I say it's historical in the sense that it will give the first meaning it gives is the earliest meaning, whereas most dictionaries today are not historical dictionaries, they're synchronic dictionaries, which means they're describing language today. They're not trying to attempt past meanings. So they will give the most frequent or core or canonical usage and meaning first. Okay, if you want more on dictionaries in general, well, you can, of course, visit the Wikipedia website on this, or go straight to the American Heritage Dictionary online and see their website, what they say about the dictionary. That's in homework, of course, you can't in the exam. Final question, 3B, and I must stress that in the exam there's no point trying to do 3 in 3B. I will mark the first of the 2 questions and not at all the second one. Some people in the past have done both, perhaps on the assumption I would take the best mark. I won't. That wouldn't be fair on the other people. So, is English spelling illogical? Well, what is logical and what is illogical? For most people, when you talk about the logic behind spelling, they tend to assume it means a connection between sounds and written form, the spoken form and the written form, which means especially whether a letter corresponds to a phoneme. If that is your only definition of logical, yet then yes, there are a lot of inconsistencies in English, but the vast majority, and I've read one figure which is 84% of words you can predict the spelling, the pronunciation from the spelling. So it's not completely illogical, it's certainly not random. The word random, for example, the first letter on the word random can't be O. Otherwise it wouldn't be pronounced random. So spelling sound correspondences aren't entirely random. There are exceptions, there are inconsistencies, but it's not completely random by any means at all. It's mostly not, in fact. When languages were first written, the first time somebody attempts to write a language, they generally try to give a letter to a sound, or if a sound doesn't exist in the letters, to give a pair of letters to a sound, or to organise the letters in a particular way so they correspond to a sound. So, for example, in English today, if you have EA together, it corresponds to the sound E, because there is no letter E, or rather the letter E is pronounced E, and not I, which is I. The problem is that even if you try to write a language for the first time using an existing alphabet, the sounds in a new language won't correspond to the existing alphabet. In the case of English, we have 26 letters which we use today, but certainly over 40 phonemes. It depends on which variety, which region, whether it's British English, American English, and so on, you're looking at, but certainly more than 40 phonemes. Now, that means it's not possible to have one letter for every sound, every phoneme. It just isn't possible. So we have to try to do inventive things with them. And that was when English was first written down. So we're talking a long, long time ago here, at least 1,000 years ago when the Normans came to England, and you can go back earlier than that as well. We did use a Latin alphabet before that, well, I say people back then used the Latin alphabet before that, but also the runic system, which was different as well. Because spelling at that time, or the use of letters or symbols at that time, was reflecting how the language is spoken, if 2 different people pronounce a word in different ways, then you would have 2 different spellings. That may sound silly, but why would 2 people pronounce the same word in 2 different ways? But if you think, even in France today, between Paris and Marseille, it's not the same pronunciation. But you want to have one written form which is intelligible by speakers of the 2 languages, which is fine. But in 1,000 years ago, communication was much more difficult than today. There were no norms, and so any time somebody was coming, they would write their own variety, or the variety of they would attribute letters to the sounds they were hearing of the person who was talking to them. When spelling did start to become fixed, a lot of changes had occurred in the language, and some of you mentioned things like Orme and Caxton and Shaw, for example, trying to fix spelling, and of course Johnson as well in his dictionary. But once spelling was relatively fixed, the sounds of language didn't stop. They carried on changing. Now, the spelling of English was more or less fixed. Fixed doesn't mean imposed from above, but it was more or less standardized, that the one spelling was accepted for most ordinary words by the majority of the population as being the usual one. It doesn't mean it's better than another, but it was the normal common standard. And the time that that was fixed was before a lot of subsequent changes in pronunciation, particularly you think of the Great Vowel Shift. Now, the Great Vowel Shift is something which happened to pronunciation, but there has been no equivalent of the Great Vowel Shift in writing. There's been no great orthographic shift. Now, this means that you have a word, for example, like nation and nationality, which are the same word, but in nation there was a change under the Great Vowel Shift because it was a long vowel, because of its position in the word. But nationality wasn't subject to the Great Vowel change because it was a short vowel due to its position in the word as a whole. So the vowel sound evolved in one of those words, but not the other. But we still have the same underlying word, nation, the root form and the derived form. Now, if you give a different spelling, if you spell nation and nationality, a and a are not the same sound. So you would want, if you want to have, if you think that logical spelling should reflect pronunciation, then you would write a different vowel letter in nation and nationality. Now, I imagine that you can see that that could lead to confusion. The fact that we have the same spelling in the N-A-T-I-O-N, the A is spelled with the letter A, whatever the pronunciation, is an advantage in many ways. If it was different, it could lead to confusion. So English spelling might be illogical in the sense that the letters don't always correspond to the sounds and vice versa, but it does have it's not illogical in the sense it's not random, it has no cause. It does have causes, and it has reasons to be like that, for etymological reasons, for historical reasons, how the word evolved, or where it came from another language. Because when you borrow a word from a foreign language, it tends to undergo a certain amount of accommodation to the spoken form of the language. When you hear French words said in English, they might sound very different to how they're pronounced in French. But we would keep the imported spelling in many cases. Okay, so there are reasons for these things. So don't just say it's illogical, end of story. Language changes, that's inevitable, and of course pronunciation evolves faster than spelling. It doesn't mean that spelling can't change, but it doesn't tend to change as fast. And when you look in France or in Germany, for example, when people have tried to introduce spelling reforms, it encounters a lot of resistance. Is spelling important, was a question which some of you mentioned. Well, yes and no. Is pronunciation important? Well, yes and no. If people can understand you, and it's how you happen to pronounce words, then fine. Spelling is a bit different because spelling is something which is learnt. It's not acquired. Everybody grows up speaking a language unless you have very severe brain problems or motor problems. And the language you speak is part of your identity. The language you spell isn't in the same way. But, of course, if you spell words in a particular way, then people are quite likely to judge you. You can imagine someone like Ted Weber writing a letter to complain about spelling in a newspaper. Because people will judge you. If you're writing a job application letter, for example, I would not recommend that you use unusual spelling. So I would recommend that you use the absolutely normal British or French or whatever spellings. If you're in America, I'd recommend you use the American spellings. In Britain, I'd recommend you use the British spellings, unless you're an American or a British person, in which case you use your variety. But that doesn't mean you can spell anything any way you want. No, there are norms, and the norms usually need to be respected. Not always. In text messages, if you want to write the standard written form in text messages, very often it's just silly. U is often much easier to write just with the letter U. That's enough, and that's appropriate in that context, but it's not appropriate in a job application, for example, or a report on something, or the papers which you write in your exams. So yes, you will be judged if you spell something wrong in the exam, if I'm marking your spelling. What else have we got? Okay, I gave the example of nation, national. Think of photo and photograph and photography and photographic. These words have recognizable spelling, but the pronunciation can be quite different. We don't reflect that in the spelling, and that can be a good thing. This means that relations are clear. It means that the fact that we have spelling which depends on the past means several things. Firstly, it's still possible today, anybody who can read English today can read a text from 100 years ago or 200 years ago or 500 years ago. You can read Shakespeare and you can understand the words, no problem. You might not know their meanings because meanings have changed, but you will recognise the words, except for the words which have disappeared. There are very, very few words, I can't think of any, but there are very, very few words, I would imagine, in Shakespeare where the spelling of the word means that you don't understand it. It's not the spelling that's the problem in most cases, possibly in some cases, but unusual. So having a fixed spelling, regardless of pronunciation changes, means that you can read text from the past, and it means that future people will be able to read your texts. If you wanted spelling to correspond to pronunciation, what pronunciation? Whose pronunciation? Pronunciation in Britain and America is different. We have, in almost all words, with a tiny number of exceptions, almost all words are spelt the same in British and American English. You can think of exceptions, but if you actually list them, you'll get a few hundred. Put that in the context of the hundreds of thousands of words there are, it's a very, very small proportion. Okay? But if you wanted spelling to reflect pronunciation, would it be British pronunciation or American pronunciation? The British wouldn't be happy having a pronunciation which didn't respect how they pronounced the language. The Americans wouldn't be happy having a spelling which didn't reflect how they speak the language. So at the moment we've got something which is a bit of the two, between the two, but everybody can read it and everybody can recognise it. You don't have to make those choices about which pronunciation do you have. Similarly with French. If somebody from Paris pronounces a word in a different way from somebody from Marseille, that doesn't mean that you should have two spelling systems, one for each. It's just daft. And in English, it's not just Britain and America, but even within Britain, Scotland, England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and of course Irish, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, Canada, and the outer circle languages as well, and the non-native speakers, if you want to include expanding circles. And even with it, say England, London and Newcastle aren't the same. And London, there are lots of people in London with very, very different pronunciations. Which pronunciation would you choose? What we need is one single standard which everybody can understand and relate to, at least, without causing offence. Is it difficult for native speakers to learn? For non-native speakers, first of all, is it difficult for non-native speakers to master English spelling? Yes, it is. Is it difficult for native speakers to master English spelling? Yes, compared to, for example, Italian, which is much more regular. And this is something which is an interesting finding which I have yet to explore, but apparently one of the possible reasons why there are higher rates of dyslexia in Britain than in Italy is partly due to the spelling system. That says what that says. We didn't say that says what that says. I'm sorry, I'm just French Gallicising myself. Something else which came out in quite a lot of your answers was that many of you were critical of the English spelling system, which is quite possible. You can defend it, as long as you do have defendable reasons. Not all reasons are valid. Some of you seem to comparing English to French, which you can do as well, saying, look at French, how logical that is, compared to English, which is illogical. Now, excuse me, there are lots of things in French which are not logical at all. When my wife, who is French, who is educated, when she writes French, if it's something important, she will often ask me to read it, to check it, the spelling. Why? I'm not a native French speaker. Of course, she should know better than me. But she knows French. Her primary knowledge of French was through acquiring it as a baby, small child, up through adolescence, teenage years, as an adult. The primary way that I learned French was by being taught it at school. So we learned all the j'arrive, tu arrives, il arrive, nous arrivons, and all the rest of it. So in many ways, my knowledge of endings of French is better than hers, because we learnt it through writing. When you can see the endings written down, the difference between AI, AIS, for example, ER and E acute, not the same thing. And that's how I learned French. That's not how she learned French. She learned French by hearing it and speaking it. So French is, the pronunciation and the spelling of French in many cases don't correspond. If it did, my wife wouldn't need me to help her. She would simply write as she speaks, as a normal, educated French person. But you can't, because then a lot of the endings would disappear. So French, okay, in English the endings disappeared before spelling became fixed. In France the endings disappeared in speech after they had become fixed in writing. So we don't say them anymore. We don't pronounce the difference between ER and E acute, or E acute and E acute ES, except for in some regional varieties. But we still write it. Not very logical. Okay, something which you don't say, you have to write. and vice versa. There's lots of individual examples that I could give. For example, how do you pronounce CC, baccalaureat, and accident? Why? Okay, you've got a reason, etc. But if CC was always pronounced K, that would make everybody's life simpler. But the fact that you've put, well, that the Académie Française and the DGLFF and other people have put rules onto these things rather than just considering them as exceptions, encourages people to think of it as being beautiful and elegant rather than just as logical as English. How do you pronounce the word exact in French? Exact or exact? You hear both. Which do you write? Who's right? Nouvel Obs, Observer, the Nouvel Obs, you know, the magazine. Why is it ps, not bz? Because it's BS, it's not P. You pronounce a p, but you write a b. Not very logical. Ah, yes, but in the context of the word, well, fine, okay, but then it ought to be written OPS. Suggérer, why is it gj and not just j? But it isn't. It's not suggérer, it's suggérer. Cognition, why is it cognition? But it's not a n, it's gn. Why? Unlike most other words. Immangeable, why isn't it immangeable? Well, because, okay. Nation, why is it not tion? Well, because it is. Okay, fine. How do you spell the sequence of the sound ar in French? The word par, P-A-R. So the sound ar is pronounced A-R. It's spelled A-R. Sorry, I'm getting myself muddled up now. Or tu pars, A-R-S. Or il part, that's A-R-E-N-T. Oh, but that's parent, which is different. Barré, B-A-R-R-E. A-R-R-E is the sound R. A-R-R-E-S, the sound R. A-R-R-E-N-T, the sound R. A-R-R-H-E-S, the sound R. And so on and so on and so on. And you can say the same about almost any sound or groups of sounds, any syllable certainly, in French can be written in many, many different ways. So yes, English is in many ways illogical in the connections between sound and writing, but so is French in its own ways, lovable ways. If you want to criticize one, that's fine, but allow the fact that you can then criticize the other. And both are wonderful things because languages are wonderful things in all aspects. Okay, right, I think I shall stop there because that's already nearly 40 minutes, and that's just me talking, so I'm sure you've had enough of that. Congratulations to most of you who did send it in. It was, on the whole, quite well done. Good luck in the exam, and happy RPs to the rest of you.